thank you very much for coming. Full house. Always nice to see a room full of people ready to taste some good whiskies. Very hot today. Like summer ended in Scotland like 2 months ago. So it lasted like 3 days. So yeah, again, thank you for being here. First time here at the Whiskybotschaft. Heard of it, never actually got to visit. So it's my pleasure. My name is Stephen Cameron. I am the European sales person for Gordon MacPhail. So I look after Germany. It's actually my biggest market and our biggest market in Europe. So you guys are doing a good job at drinking whiskey. So kudos for that.
We give our best.
Yeah, well, I know it's hard, right? But guess what? There's more. So we're good. We're good. Very well. No, thank you again for coming. So today I'll speak about Gordon MacPhail, the independent bottler, one of the oldest independent bottlers in Scotland. Well, first of all, has anybody here heard about Gordon MacPhail before?
Yes.
Raise your hand. Yeah, a few hands. Okay, good. So not everybody, which is also good because then, well, I'm here for a reason. So Gordon MacPhail originally was not an independent bottler as such. It was actually a shop. So a shop in a small town in Speyside called Elgin. I say small town. Most people in the Highland thinks Elgin is a big city, just because everything is relative, you know. So small town based in Speyside called Elgin, and Mr. Gordon and Mr. MacPhail had this idea to open this this shop that would import and sell fine food and beverages from, well, maybe not all over the world, but back then everything that was not UK made was exotic. I mean, it was created in 1895, and they were importing tea blends, coffee, chocolate, cured meats, cheese, lots of wine as well, and especially sherry wine, which is where the whiskey theme kind of kicks in. So they had this idea. They were doing a little bit of whiskey blending as well on the side. Again, the blended Scotch whiskey back then was the predominant style of whiskey. Well, still is today, but even more so back then. And single malt was more of a local Scottish thing, really, not so much at export. So they started that business, hired a person called John Urquhart, and John Urquhart really developed the whiskey side of the business a little bit more. And what he did was starting to do fillings at distilleries. So Gordon MacPhail would import sherry from Spain. The sherry was bottled, sold on to consumers, and then these empty casks were then sent to distilleries to be filled with new make spirit. So Gordon MacPhail never actually bought aged whiskey from the distilleries. They were commissioning fillings from these distilleries. And that's something that to some extent we still do today. I'll get into it a little bit later. So these sherry casks, after they had been filled at the distilleries, would stay in their warehouse for a while, or eventually be brought in our own warehouse, and the whiskey bottled and sold. Still a little bit of blending, but more and more so as single malt, which back then was, again, not something that was extremely common. Why? Because generally you would get a much faster return on investment if you were blending your whiskey at a very young age with some very cheap grain whiskey, rather than aging it for longer and bottle it as single malt. So people thought that they were a little bit crazy at the time, because again, when it comes to making money, it wasn't the fastest way or the easiest way, really. John Urquhart was an employee. Eventually, in 1915, he became a senior partner after John Alexander MacPhail retired from the business. Shortly after, James Gordon died, and he became the sole owner of Gordon MacPhail. Never changed the name, so today the Urquhart family is still the sole owner of that company, but they never actually changed the name to Urquhart Whiskey Company. So that's a little bit of the background. John Urquhart, so very keen on single malt, brought his son into the business in 1933, so his son George. George took it even further. He really believed that single malt was the future and was the way to go, so he really developed that aspect of the business even more, doing more fillings with more distilleries. And that's when Gordon MacPhail really transitioned from being this local grocery shop to something a little bit more, well, a whiskey company, and started doing more and more export as well. The pivotal, I would say, date for us was 1968, when George Urquhart launched a range called the Connoisseur's Choice range, We'll have an example later. And that was the first time that you had such a variety of single malt within the same range bottled by the same people. Some of these distilleries you may have heard of that were in the first batch were Talisker, Dalwhinnie, Oban, Macallan. So names that today everybody knows and are very famous of their own doing with their own proprietors. But back then not so much. The independent bottlers were basically the only people from which you could actually try get to taste these whiskeys as single malt. So again, a very important turn, 1968, when that range was launched. So to give you a little bit of an update as to what we do today, very quickly. So Gordon MacPhail, we still have our shop in Elgin. You can still buy your meat and your cheese from us if you want. But obviously most people know us because of the whiskey. Wide variety of single malts in our portfolio. Some younger ones, some very, very old ones. As a matter of fact, the oldest whiskeys ever bottled were bottled by Gordon MacPhail as a company. We no longer bottle sherry because we can't do that outside of Spain anymore. But we do have, however, some agreements with sherry cooperages and sherry bodegas where we do seasoning programs for our sherry casks. So we actually still only buy new make spirit from distilleries. If you had to walk out here today and only remember one thing, remember that Gordon MacPhail doesn't buy casks. We buy new make spirit. We decide the type of cask that we want, the one type that we think will complement the distillery character the most. And depending on how much we're planning on aging it, we will go with first fill bourbon, refill American hogshead, refill sherry hogshead, first fill sherry hogshead, cherry butt, you name it. We usually stick to the more traditional types of casks, bourbon and sherry. We dabble sometimes in wine casks a little bit, but we're not trying to be fancy. We really usually stick to the more classic ones. So without further ado, and because it's always boring to listen to somebody talk forever about their brand without having anything to drink, I've been there. Please grab your first glass. This first whiskey is it's a new range that we launched last year called Discovery Range. Comes in these kinds of tins. And what we did with that range is divided in three subcategories: bourbon matured, sherry matured, and peated. The single malts might change within each sub-range, but they will always follow that divide, if you'd like. The one you have in your glass today is a Glenrothes 11 years old that is fully matured in sherry casks, first fill and refill. So let's have a nose. The sherry influence is pretty obvious. You have automatically the citrus notes, the chocolatey undertone. Something a little bit, not spicy, but like on the slight touch of like wood influence. Glenrothes is a distillery that, even though now they have a range that's pretty well established, I would say probably you didn't see much before. As an official bottling, and even with independent bottlers, not something that is overly common. It's a local distillery, as I said. Elgin is based in Speyside, and therefore we're quite strong with local Speyside distilleries. Why? Because we've been dealing with these guys for over 120 years in some cases. So Glenrothes is one of them. This whiskey is bottled at 43%, which is why I said 43, yeah. 43, yeah. So I mentioned the sherry seasoning programs that we were doing, because let's be honest, today a sherry cask is a seasoned sherry cask. There are very, very few bodega casks out there, and guess what? They're not always the best cask to mature whiskey in. They tend to be very old, not very active, and don't necessarily make the best whiskeys. What we do with a seasoned cask is that we give our criteria to the coopers in Spain, where we specify the type of oak, American oak, European oak, the size of the cask, 250 liters for hogsheads, 500 liters for sherry butts, and the length of seasoning. For us, it will be two years Oloroso seasoning for hogsheads and 3 years Oloroso for sherry butts. We actually only use Oloroso sherry casks at this point in time. People ask me why. Not sure. It is kind of our signature style, I guess. Maybe that's the style of sherry that will give you the fruitiness, but not so much sweetness. And because we tend to bottle whiskeys at a slightly more advanced age, well, I would say that PX can be overwhelming sometimes. So Oloroso is the preferred choice in our case. The type of oak is very important, by the way. Many people focus on ex-bourbon, ex-sherry, but the difference in taste between a European oak sherry cask and American oak sherry cask is quite significant. American oak has a much tighter grain, which makes and also has a lot of naturally present in the wood a compound called vanillin, which will give you a slightly more vanilla flavor in a more floral type of profile, whereas European oak, which has not as much vanillin and much more tannins and eugenol, will usually give you something a little bit spicier with a little bit more bite to it. So a whiskey also that will be much darker. Same age, same type of cask, well, same size of cask, European oak will almost always be 2 shades darker than an American oak cask. So don't be surprised if you see sometimes first fill sherry butt and the whiskey is actually not that dark. It's not that surprising, especially if it's a younger whiskey, because the wood to liquid ratio is is lower, and also American oak doesn't darken the whiskey as much. In this case, I would say it's probably a mix of both. We tend, when we do batches, we tend to try and find the right balance between European sherry hogsheads and American oak sherry butts, which is in most cases what it is. Not gonna lie, Germany tends to like their sherried whiskeys. We can see that on the sales side, and our importer is always like, oh, what sherry cask do you have? Are you sure? Did you look properly? But no, as I said, Germany is a very important market for us. You tend to get some of the good stuff. Some of the best stuff usually ends up in Germany at some point. So what I like about this whiskey is that it's an all day, all round kind of dram, and also it's pretty accessible. I think they retail in Germany for around 50 euros. That's the other thing that I like about Gordon MacPhail. We don't just do very old, expensive whiskeys from Coles distilleries or from past decades. We also try and offer whiskeys that are affordable and that the everyday drinker that wants to go a little bit further in their whiskey adventures can afford. So this range in general, the Discovery range is perfect for that. Also 43%, which for some is not enough, but for a lot of drinkers is a good step into the like higher strength whiskeys. By the way, if there are any questions at any point, I will happily take them, just so you don't listen to me blab for an hour. The company as a whole, so we have our own warehouse in Elgin, which has approximately 7,500 casks, and then we have roughly around 8,000 casks outside of our warehouse, either at the distilleries of origin or in third-party warehousing sites. You never want to have all your eggs in the same basket. Like in the event that there is a fire, touch wood, never happened. Well, you don't lose everything. I must say though that the oldest, rarest casks that we have, we try and keep a closer eye on them. So they're usually closer to us in Elgin, not just because we want to check on them more often to make sure that the spirit is still okay, that it doesn't go under strength or anything like that, but also because, well, warehousemen from other companies, we trust our warehousemen. I don't know about the other guys. Angel's share can be very variable depending on where your whiskey is stored. So as I mentioned, Gordon MacPhail is still family owned. We're now the 4th generation of the Urquhart family that's running the business. And I really say running. I mean, they're not just cashing their checks. They're actually involved in the company at different positions in different departments. And they really intend to keep it that way. I think we couldn't do what we do if we had to pay dividends to shareholders, because our wood policy is quite strict. We only pick the best casks. We don't refill casks for like an unlimited amount of times, and all this generates quite a bit of money of cost. And so therefore, wood sourcing is actually our biggest cost as a business. Before the filling, before employees, before everything else, it is the number one spending that we do. And the family has always been really careful as to how much whiskey they bottle, at what rate, and try to not sell everything all in one go, again, to generate a lot of money. They really are careful at the rate at which they do that. They have this rule, which I think is a great rule in the company, that is that each generation that takes over the business, each generation that leaves the business has to have more casks in the warehouse than there were when they started. And that really forces them to have this very sustainable approach to bottling whiskey as a company. Of course, we don't fill with as many distilleries as we used to. We probably don't get many fillings from Talisker, Oban, in Macallan today, but in some cases we still have some of these older whiskies in the warehouse, which is extremely handy, because I mentioned we do rely on distillers to do what we do. And in this day and age, most of the time, if not all the time, it is done through a contract. We have filling contract with distillery XYZ, where we commit to, they commit to selling us X number of, the equivalent of X number of casks of new make over the course of X number of years. Well, when it comes down to the time to renegotiate those deals, having casks of their whiskey from a much older period comes in handy, because then we have a good bargaining tool. And in most cases, they don't have that stuff themselves. They don't have casks from the 50s, 60s, 70s from their own distilleries, but we do. So there is always a conversation behind closed doors that goes on between the distillers and Gordon MacPhail. And we're happy to help if there's something in it for us, which there usually is. Very well. Well, can move to whiskey number 2. One of my favorite Gordon MacPhail bottlings.
Before we continue,
yeah, please.
Did I miss which cask was it?
So this one is, I'll leave it at sherry cask. It's a combination of first fill and refill sherry cask. Probably some hogsheads and some sherry butts in it, but 100% sherry.
100% sherry.
You can sherry Oloroso. You can that much I can tell you is absolutely accurate. The proportion of sherry butts, sherry hogsheads, I don't have it. But yeah, sherry, Untitled. This one is also a fully sherry matured whiskeys. As a matter of fact, every single whiskey today is fully sherry matured. We fill, I think it's 60% of our fillings are done in sherry casks. Again, it goes against industry standards, because most whiskey, as you know, is matured in ex-bourbon or refill hogsheads. Why? Because it's so much cheaper to do it that way. So a lot of that whiskey will go into blends, and blends today probably don't have as much sherried whiskey in them for obvious reasons. But we as a company still rely a lot on sherry casks. We have 3 different suppliers in Spain, 3 different seasoning programs that we do. 2 companies, so 2 coopers, País Lobato and Juan Pino. They make the casks, they season them, they send them over. And then another company, which also happens to be a bodega, that also does seasoning on the side, which is Williams & Humbert. Gordon MacPhail used to bottle Williams & Humbert sherry until the 70s. And after that, we still got the occasional casks, transport casks, but after that, we started seasoning casks with them as well. They work a lot with other companies. I think their biggest customer of theirs is Edrington, so Macallan Highland Park gets a lot of casks from Williams & Humbert as well. The second whiskey, one of my favorites, and probably one whiskey for most people discover Gordon MacPhail through either this one, Linkwood 15-year-old, or Mortlach 15-year-old. These are part of our distillery label range. It's a weird semi-official type of range. So as you can see, it looks like an official bottling if it wasn't for the fact that at the bottom you have the Gordon MacPhail name written in quite small letters. Actually, the accent has really been put on the distillery on this one. We've been doing these labels for years, and especially Linkwood, Mortlach, were probably the two most famous names within that range. And we still do today. So this has not really, except the shape of the bottle that changed last year, the label itself has probably not changed in like decades. So I like the retro kind of look to it, but mostly I love the whiskey that's inside it. So this whiskey is matured in a combination of first fill and refill sherry casks. Again, probably a mix of sizes, but 100% sherry. Linkwood, as you might know, is a local, is an Elgin-based distillery, so it's quite local to us. It used to be just outside of Elgin. Elgin has grown quite a bit, so now it's just on the fringe. Beautiful, beautiful whiskey in my opinion. It's a sherried whiskey that still has that very fresh green apple, orchard fruit nose to it. It's a very delicate malt and not overly sherried. That's the one thing that I like also is I'm not a huge fan of sherry bombs because I like to smell the distillery character, and in this case I find it works perfect because you definitely get a lot of that Linkwood freshness and like juiciness, but still with that slight touch of sherry that really rounds up the whole thing. One of the reasons why the character of Linkwood is so fruity as a single malt is due to their distillation process. It's not for those of you who are a little bit more nerdy in the audience. Well, do you know why that might be? Actually, I'm just going to ask you. No, fruity character of Linkwood. Any idea where that could come from? A lot of distilleries have fruity character, so it's a very hard one. But in this case, it's because of the amount of copper contact during the distillation. The lightness or heaviness of a spirit is always usually defined by the amount of copper contact that you have. In Linkwood, they have a lot of copper contact, and the reason for that is because the spirit stills for the second distillation are actually bigger than the wash stills, which goes against logic because normally you end up with a lot of product that you distill, then you have less, so you put it in a slightly smaller still. Logical, right? Well, at Linkwood, they don't. They put less liquid in a much bigger still to really increase that copper contact during distillation and make a very light, pure style of spirit. There are two other distilleries for which it is the case, to my knowledge. Not a lot of people know that, but these other two are Clynelish and Glendullan. They are the only three distilleries that have spirit stills bigger than the wash stills.
Clynelish and?
Glendullan and Clynelish. Yeah. Whoop. Throwing my whiskey. We have bottled Linkwood for quite some time, and we had the chance to bottle some very old ones in recent years. I think the latest one was a 1953, I believe, last year, or a year and a half ago. Again, as I said, family has always been very cautious, and so we still have today casks in the warehouse dating back from the 40s, 50s, 60s onwards, which is quite a unique position to be in. And honestly, I'm very humbled because sometimes I go to the tasting panel, and half the time the whiskey that's on the table is older than my parents, which really makes you think that it is a very odd situation to be in as a young whiskey person, to have the honor to try these things from past decades. It is literally history in a bottle, because so much has changed in the production process and the varieties of barley and everything really, except that it's made on the same site, but these sites have been upgraded year after year, and some distillery characters are completely different. If you try older whiskeys from Speyside from the 40s, 50s, they are so much heavier than what they are today for the most part. We base our decision on what type of cask to use for what distillery on several things, but also we have this thing in our head office in the basement called the Liquid Library. The Liquid Library has a lot of cask samples taken from casks during their lifetime but dating back to, I don't know, 1930s, 40s, 50s. So casks that were drawn back then. So we can see how the spirit of that distillery has evolved through time, and decide, well, because what was right back then for a heavy character may not be the best type of cask today when the distillery character has gone much lighter. So we will try and adapt our the way we fill the casks and the type of cask that we send to these distilleries based on that. So again, we are in a way maturation experts. That's what we do. We mature whiskey. We buy the new make, we don't produce it, but we mature the whiskey 100% ourselves and following our own sets of criteria. Has anybody been to our shop in Elgin? No? Well, you have? So if you are ever in Speyside, chances are you'll end up in Elgin at some point because, well, all the supermarkets are there. And Elgin we still have the original shop from which Gordon MacPhail started. So it's still a shop, as I said. You can still buy your sandwich, your meat, and your cheese if you want. But they also have this very nice whiskey room at the back. Well, you have loads of our whiskeys, all price ranges, and also some other whiskeys that we distribute. And upstairs we have a nice tasting room, and you can book tastings. Again, you basically set the limit as to what you want to spend, and we will make sure to provide the whiskeys accordingly. So it's one of the attractions in Elgin, I must say. We're actually, I think, number one on Visit Scotland and TripAdvisor as to things to do in Elgin. There's not that much to do in Elgin. But yeah, it's really worth a visit if you have the chance, just because the selection is great, and the setup really kind of throws you back in time. We try to keep it as authentic as possible, while obviously upgrading for health and safety reasons and all these things. The warehouse is also in Elgin still. If you go to Tesco, you'll see it. It's right across the parking lot. Sadly, we don't do warehouse tours, although I'm sure everybody would die to do that. It's just a very old warehouse, and it's not very, well, user-friendly in some ways. So we have to be careful with that. But other than that, you can still try some very nice whiskeys at the shop, and they're more than happy to accommodate. I really enjoy this whiskey, even if it's hot. It's still fresh. It's not. The alcohol is not crushing. I mean, it is 43%, so it is not the highest either. But it is, for me, one of the most, again, classic bottlings from Gordon MacPhail, but that just doesn't go old. It's a whiskey that I would happily offer to anybody that comes to my place, because it is very representative of the style of whiskeys that we produce, and also a very local whiskey to us. Any questions so far? No? No questions? No?
How many casks you got in your warehouses, approximate?
So we have 7,500 in Elgin and around 8,000 outside of Elgin. So either at the distilleries of origin or in other sites. We try as much as we can to keep the whiskey at the distilleries of origin. The problem is today in 2019, well, actually some distilleries don't even have warehouses on site. The spirit is produced there. It's put into a tanker. Tanker goes down south or to some like centralized filling station, filled into casks. Eventually, some casks will be sent back to the distillery if they have space, but a lot of times it just end up in like massive warehouses down south in the Central Belt, closer to the blending centers and the bottling lines. And so yeah, That's the slightly less romantic view about Scotch whiskey. We don't really do that because we're small, but that's just the way it is. So that's how many casks we have roughly. But one thing I forgot to mention is, so the casks that we do fill, we won't actually look at them for the first 8 years of their life. Like for 8 years, they will sit in whatever warehouse they are in, and we will only request a sample after 8 years. That's when we will assess the quality of the spirit, whether or not the maturation is going properly, and then we will decide on the fate of that cask. So if the cask is showing some good signs of a steady maturation, well, we will probably plan to bottle that cask in the coming years. If we think that the cask is not really aging how we wanted it to, we will eventually re-rack that cask into a fresh cask to try and pursue the maturation. So a cask that has maybe a little bit more to give, like a first fill or a second fill maybe. And in some cases, the whiskey is good, but we can see potential for greatness and for maybe a slightly longer maturation, and we believe the whiskey has not reached its peak yet. So we will give that cask a few more years, and again, sampling still regularly, maybe every couple of years, to check that things are going according to plan. We're not in the business of making wood juice. We're in the business of making whiskey that we think tastes good. So we also, even the oldest releases, if we bottle them, it's because we believe that there is still that balance between spirit, distillery character, and cask influence. It's not bottling old whiskey for the sake of bottling old whiskeys, which, let's be honest, they'll still sell because today a lot of these are like investment vessels anyway. So nobody's going to crack them open. So nobody really cares if it tastes good or not. But we do. So we will only put our name on a bottle, or even bottle to start with a whiskey if we believe that it is up to our quality standards.
You got a good fire insurance for your warehouse?
I don't
remember the news from America.
Yeah, well,
48,000.
they've been pretty unlucky in the States recently, between the warehouses collapsing and the warehouses catching fire. Warehouse catching fire is a pretty common thing. I mean, it happened to Wild Turkey, it happened to Bernheim, it happened to a bunch of distilleries in the States over the course. I mean, let's be honest, maybe, I don't know, it's not as hot in Scotland, obviously, so maybe it's not as much of a thing. The weather tends to be probably more, friendly. So not a lot of storms or anything like that. I mean, don't get me wrong, it has happened in the past. I mean, during World War II, lots of warehouses were blown up in flames and all that. I think Banff is the unluckiest distillery in Scotland. They've been bombed like 4 times or something like that. Well, it burned 4 times. Once because it was bombed, then other things happened. I mean, so I don't know about our insurance policy, to be honest. It's not a part of the business that I deal with, but it is obviously a thing. I mean, every whiskey company has to. In most cases, what happens is that distilleries will trade casks. They don't trade the casks themselves, but they will swap casks with their neighbors so that they have a little bit of their casks spread. And they spread the risk a little bit. So, for example, I know that Balblair in Etterton, which is very close to Glenmorangie, and had quite a bit of a warehousing capacity, had loads of casks of Glenmorangie for the longest time. Tomatin Distillery, which is a massive distillery, used to be a massive distillery back in the 70s, has huge warehouses all over the place because they were so big back then. And they even today rent warehousing space to all kinds of whiskey companies. So you see a lot of that. If you go to Diageo warehouse of any of their distilleries, whatever is the whiskey of that distillery is probably the one you'll see the least, because they'll have the whiskeys from all their other ones in there. So it makes no sense. But I mean, when you visit it, but obviously it's for insurance purposes. I don't know to which extent we do that. To be honest, it's a part of the business that I'm not actually involved in, but I imagine that, again, part of the reason why we try and keep the casks at their distilleries of origin is probably for that reason. And also, our warehouse in Elgin is not big. Even though 7,500 casks may sound like a lot, it actually is not. If you compare to most warehouses, it's quite tiny. So we bring the casks usually when they're getting closer to bottling date, because yes, we also do bottle everything on site for Gordon MacPhail, which is again pretty unique. Not a lot of distilleries still have their entire bottling operation in-house. But the family was always very keen on keeping the jobs local, and they're from Elgin, and they want to give back to the community and hire people locally for as much as possible. So again, maybe not the cheapest option, but that's the one they went with because that's just the way they want to do it. Very well. Well, maybe we'll go to the third whiskey, so then you'll have maybe some time after to finish your drafts. We ask more questions. Usually, once the whiskey kicks in, people have more questions. So maybe this last whiskey is quite special. It's a single cask strength whiskey in our Connoisseur's Choice range. Connoisseur's Choice has gone through many different packagings, many different styles. The original one that I mentioned, the Talisker and all that, were in like black labels, red lettering. Not the prettiest thing to look at, to be honest. The whiskey was fantastic, absolutely, but not in today's world it probably wouldn't sell that well. Then we did a lot of batches for many years at 40%. Then we increased to 43. Then we increased to 46. And finally, because the demand. The market demand for cask strength whiskey was so big, and that was probably, in our case, a criticism that we were hearing a lot of, like, oh, it's good, but why are whiskeys all 46%? We decided to finally integrate our cask strength range, which did exist, into our Connoisseur's Choice range. So Connoisseur's Choice cask strength, usually single cask. And we also do small batches at 46 occasionally, and even more occasionally we do small batches of wine-finished whiskies at 45%. But this one in the grey foil, single cask strength. This is a Highland Park, 2001, matured in a refill sherry butt. This one is...
Is this 45%?
No, this one is cask strength, 57.8%. Yeah, 57.8, 592 bottles worldwide. Highland Park, big name, obviously. We have bottled Highland Park for many years. I say that about pretty much every distillery that we bottle because, well, we've been bottling a lot of distilleries for many years. But a very interesting whiskey, obviously. The nose of Highland Park, for me, even though this one is nicely sherried, is pretty unmistakable. Again, cask strength, so if you feel like adding some water, please do so. What did I say, 57.8, sorry. I find that the typical smokiness of Highland Park in this one is there, but if you add just a drop of water, it will become way more obvious. And that's something that I absolutely love about that distillery, that just nice, dry smoke from like kind of a log fire that went out. Not that very oily medicinal peat note that you have on Isla, but something way more subtle than that. An ashy kind of smoke, but with the added deliciousness of a sherry maturation.
This one is bottled in 2019, so it's 18 years old?
It was actually bottled in 2019, but it's in 17-year-old, so it must have been bottled just before reaching its birthday.
Hey? Ja, das ist ein Tropfen, das wird vielleicht das komplett. Ich habe vorher gewusst.
So, obviously, I didn't mention it, but it goes without saying, every single whiskey from Gordon MacPhail is natural color. Funny enough, we don't write it on the label. I don't know why, because it's not. I mean, it is natural color, so we should. But so yeah, so natural color, cask strength, so no chill filtration on that one. Whatever is bottled at 46% will have a light chill filtration, as in a higher temperature than average. So we chill filter at like 3 Celsius, I think, just to make sure that the whiskey doesn't turn cloudy when it's reduced. But other than that, it's a light chill filtration and natural color.
Is the natural color filter thing for every Gordon MacPhail whiskey?
Yes. So, well, the natural color for all of them, and the non-chill filtration for anything that's 46 and above.
Okay.
Everything that's under 46 will be lightly chill filtered, just for the sake of the whiskey not being completely cloudy. So our Connoisseur's Choice range is always in high demand. These whiskeys tend to sell quite fast because again they're mostly single casks now. Again, you're lucky enough that Germany gets usually a fair amount of single casks exclusive to Germany because the market is big enough that they can take all that whiskey and sell it to you guys. But if it is a split cask between several markets, well, sometimes it will sell very fast. So we have to be, you have to be quick. If you like something, don't wait too long because again, always a limited number of bottles. There's always going to be more the year after, and so on, and so and so. But if there's one cask you particularly like, I always tell people to not think too long about it because before you know it, it's gone. Especially casks like Highland Park. Well, whiskeys like Highland Park are big names, and Highland Park sherried of that price, of that age at that price, usually tend to sell quite quickly. So it's very quiet now. So I'm thinking that people are enjoying this. Yeah. Very good. Fun fact about our Highland Park casks: we actually keep those casks and our casks from Scapa Distillery at Scapa Distillery. So we actually keep those casks on Orkney for as long as possible. And again, I don't think it's necessarily the case for their own inventories in this case, but I don't know. I think we have an agreement with Scapa. One of my colleagues whose family member told us like, "Oh, you were at Scapa. Did you go and check out our casks?" It was like, "Well, I wasn't told that that's where they were." It was like, "Oh yeah, no, we have all our Highland Park casks and Scapa casks there." I was like, "Well, could have been on my own, warehouse tasting tour, and it's my own stuff, so I could have been, left alone." But no, it was like the information came in too late. Do you still have a lot of this one in Germany? Not that much, right? Because that was, I think we sold that in March, but no, April.
So someone else.
Yeah.
Not many.
So there is still some, if you're interested. Anyone else? Does everybody have any questions so far? Yeah? All clear? Very well. Come again?
How often do you refill the cask?
How often do we refill casks? So there is no exact rule, except that we still, again, have pretty high standards. From my experience, I've seen first fill, second fill, sometimes third fill. I think I've seen a fourth fill twice. Because again, the cask will be reassessed after it's been emptied. But I have never seen a fifth fill in the samples that I've come across. So I would say no more than 4 times. And again, 4 is probably quite exceptional. And it will probably be used for a much lighter style of whiskey to mature in. These casks won't be we won't use them ourselves after that, but we'll sell them through the Speyside Cooperage in Craigellachie. They will eventually fix them, rejuvenate them, but we won't be using those casks ourselves. They will be sold on to other distillers, but not for us. So generally speaking, I would say third fill is on average, and fourth fill I've seen it twice, so quite rarely.
And how do you or someone else check if a cask is good enough to be second or third?
I think it's mainly of what was the whiskey that they dumped from that cask. If it was, if it still had color or anything like that. I imagine, and of course, if it's a very, very old cask from a very old first fill sherry, but 40, 50 years old, we're obviously not going to reuse that cask.
There's no one biting the wood.
Yeah, exactly. So no, we don't lick the staves. We don't chew on the wood. I'm not sure. It would be a good question for my colleagues at Whisky Supply as to what criteria they have to decide whether or not a cask is still good. I honestly, personally, don't have an answer on that one. But I imagine it would be mostly based on the color of whatever came out before, and I mean not just color but also flavor profile. If it was still quite an expressive whiskey with a nice wood influence, and the cask wasn't too old, they're probably going to reuse that cask for something much lighter usually. We do have a steady supply of fresh casks because of refill of second fill casks, because as you may know, Gordon MacPhail owns the distillery Glenrothes in Speyside, and Glenrothes has a strict first fill policy. They only use first fill bourbon, first fill sherry. So once these casks have been used once at Glenrothes, they will never use them again. So because we're the same company, we will reuse these casks for a second fill for Gordon MacPhail bottlings, but not for Glenrothes.
How old was the oldest whiskey?
So the oldest whiskey that I have seen.
Was 70 years
So
old.
at the moment, the oldest whiskey ever bottled was a 75-year-old. It was a Mortlach 1939 that we bottled back in 1939 plus 75. You do the math. I can't remember. So that is the oldest whiskey to date. We before that did a 70-year-old Mortlach and a 70-year-old Glenlivet before that. That being said, I have seen with my own eyes cask of Glengrant 1940 in the warehouse. So that is technically the oldest whiskey in existence, in my opinion. I mean, unless somebody's hiding something somewhere. But that's the only ones I've seen of myself. And I would put good money on the fact that this oldest whiskey record will be probably broken in the years to come, just because we still have these things. Again, not all whiskeys are meant to be aged that long, and I would believe that if they're still waiting, it's probably because the whiskey is still probably not maturing as fast, because let's be honest, the casks at that age probably are of a very slow impact or low impact, but they're still overproof and they're still good enough to still be in there. So yeah, watch this space. Time will tell. Well, that's all for me. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, if you have any questions, please raise your hand. Yeah, thank you for coming. Oh, please.
Just one nerdy question.
Yeah.
Is the Urquhart family owning Gordon MacPhail? Is this the Urquhart family from Urquhart Castle?
It's funny, I had the exact same question last night. Sadly for them, they are not. Urquhart is actually a pretty common last name in the northeast part of Scotland, in this part, because you have Urquhart Castle, and then you also have a village outside of Elgin that's called Urquhart. And you have Glen Urquhart as well. So it is. I do not believe there is any connection, at least not for a long time. That is not where they live, and I don't think they own it. But yeah. Well, very well. Again, well, thank you very much for coming. It was my pleasure to have you. I hope you enjoyed your whiskeys. And if you have any more questions, I'll be around for a few more minutes to then jump in the car and do another tasting far away from here. So it's German tasting tours are always busy. I mean, I know that when I come here, they will make the most of my time, and it will not go to waste. So always a pleasure to come.
Depending on our highways, you can be fast everywhere.
Well, that's his job. Very well.
Tempo limit here. Kein Problem. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.